In today's WoodStory, we are going to be making matching Christmas snack trays using two different methods. One method using a router and the other method using a bandsaw. So go grab your tools and let's start this WoodStory. This wood is 2 inches thick, but the template that we're working with today doesn't necessarily require wood that's this thick. What it's gonna do is it's gonna give me a lot more depth in my tray. And you can accomplish the same thing by just gluing different pieces together. So if you don't have one continuous piece of wood, no worries whatsoever. Just do it the same way that you would do it if you were making a cutting board. And then once all the pieces are glued up, you can essentially have it any depth that you would like. I just happen to have this from a previous project and it's been sitting around on my shelf forever, so now it's finally time to use it. The actual template in itself is 17 inches long and it is 7.5 inches wide. And what we're gonna do is we are going to be routering out this. We're gonna cut most of it on the bandsaw and then we're gonna router the inside. And then we're gonna have 2 of these, so you're gonna need twice the amount, and we're gonna put them together, and that's gonna give us a really cool tray for our holiday table. So let's get started with this one. We are going to be exploring 2 different methods for making these trays today. One will be using a drill press and multiple router bits, and the second version is only going to require a bandsaw. And I've gone ahead and made both the traceable template free for you to use, that would be for method number 2, or if you would like to purchase the router template for method number 1, then you'll find that on my website as well. Once your template is traced and the piece cut to a more manageable size, start by removing as much material as possible, staying away from the lines, of course. I am using my bandsaw with a resaw blade, but ideally a 1/4 inch blade with a low teeth per inch, also known as TPI, will make this go a lot faster, and it will also help get around the curves. So you may be asking, why am I using a resaw blade if I'm recommending a 1/4 inch blade to you? And it comes down to complete laziness and the fact that I absolutely hate changing my bandsaw blade. So I'd rather be lazy and use this giant blade than take 30 minutes to change the blade, because that's how long it takes me to change the blade. Next, I'm using my drill press with a very large Forstner bit to essentially carve out as much of the inside in order to speed up the next step. Just make sure to not go anywhere near the lines. You could of course also use a handheld drill with a Forstner bit to do this, but a drill press just makes it a lot easier. I prefer to attach my wood to the table using double-sided tape, as this avoids the use for clamps that will get in the way when you're routering. Just make sure to use quality double-sided tape. You don't want the piece to go flying. I like to use this particular tape. It's easy to use, inexpensive, and you can get it off of Amazon, and it works great and comes in huge rolls. I will leave the link down below if you're interested. I didn't like all the jagged lines I ended up with after using the Forstner bit over on the drill press, which is why I decided to use my chisel to remove as many of these as possible. Now, this may be overkill, but I hate when my router jerks, as it really scares me. So anything I can do to make routering a bit more of a smooth experience is a step that I am willing to take. And yes, it still happens when I'm only taking off about 1/4 inch at a time. It's not like I'm trying to remove all of this material at once. So if you're like me, and if you want a safer and more smooth routering experience, you can do the same thing. Or if you have some great advice for how to actually avoid my router jumping all over the place, then I would also love to hear that down in the comments below. I attached my Christmas tree router template with the same double-sided tape as before. Now, this template is available on my website, and you may notice that here in the video that my template is made from plywood. That's because I usually make them out of plywood first before I offer them for sale in cast acrylic. But you can rest assured that the one that you will order off my website is going to be in 5mm thick cast acrylic, which is going to last you a very long time. A large part of this method for making the tray is the routering. It is time consuming and certainly messy, and you will definitely be covered in sawdust afterwards. So eye protection and possibly a dust mask may be a good idea. You will also need multiple bits for your router and a large base for it. I'll talk a little bit more about this a little later in the video. So there's a couple of things that I'd like to go over when it comes to routering. When we are making big trays like this one, it is really important that you have a base for your router that's nice and wide. And I'll give you an example of why. So this is my smaller handheld router, and in theory, you would be able to use this too. But as soon as you get into the edges, it's going to go on its side and not be able to give you proper support, which can be a safety concern. So it is much easier and safer to do it when you have a nice big plate like this one. Now this one I made myself, I cut it on my laser, but all routers have the ability to change these ones out. You can purchase them on Amazon or your preferred hardware store. But take a look at your router and see what options there are. There's also some nice generic ones now that fit with most screws that work. Now, this is an ancient router, so I had a hard time finding it, which is why I ended up making my own. Now, the mistake that I made was I did not make this see-through. I made it out of hazed acrylic, which is not great. You want it to be clear so that you can see all of your work. But I do have a nice hole in the bottom here, so it works for now, but I'm probably going to upgrade that soon. But again, you can do the same thing with the DeWalt, the smaller ones. Now, when you are routering, there are many different ways that you can do it. You can use something like this, which is a bushing that essentially has a bit that sits on the inside that allows you to ride the template against this point right here. So essentially it's a templating bit without it being a templating bit, because this is just a spiral bit in itself. There's no additional bearing on this one. Or you can use something that already has the bearing on it, like this one, and that one will allow you to go right along the edge. These are really useful, but when you are getting started with template routing, there's a few things you want to keep in mind. One is your template is probably just going to be between 5, maybe even less millimeters thick, which means that you need something that's going to start removing material from the beginning. The last thing you want is to have something like this, because it's not going to be able to hit your template, and this is not a safe amount to be removing regardless of what machine you're using. So you want to work your way down, and that's why these smaller ones are really handy. You want to start that way, because essentially what this is going to do is it's going to go along the edge that you already have, and it's going to create the exact same edge, which means that after a while, when you run out of this amount, you can switch to one that's slightly bigger, and it's going to do the same thing. So as long as you're doing it and there's no bumps or anything like that, it will continue to copy what you have already done, and that way you can work your way down. And these come in all kind of different sizes. You can see I have one in here as well right now. For this one right here, where we're going over an inch down, this is the last bit that I'm going to be using. It's not going to be any longer than that, because my actual router, this is a plunge router, has the ability to extend a bit as well. So you don't always need these really, really big ones. These are much more useful when it comes to the outside if you want to do some template routing on the outside. That's where these ones come in handy, but not for the inside. For the inside, you want the small ones, and you want ideally a set that's going to allow you to go up in size as we go along. And then lastly, you can also get something that's called a bowl bit. The idea with this one is that it's going to create more of a curved edge on the inside versus it being your standard 90-degree. It can also make it a little bit easier to hand sand it afterwards. I don't always like it. I find sometimes I get more of a bevel effect with this. It might just be the type that I'm using. There's obviously other ones in the market, but if you are looking for that more of a bowl effect, then this is the kind of bit that you want to be looking for. So now I'm at the point in my routering where I just have a few more holes to take care of. So I'm going to go and I'm going to plunge it down just a hair more to get rid of these last little marks. And then the inside is pretty much done. So the inside of the tray is pretty much all routed out right now, but there is one really tight spot right up here, and there's a couple of options for removing that. One, you can use a chisel, which is probably going to be the easiest, but you can also use a router bit that's just really, really tiny, such as this right here. This is a teeny little tiny templating bit. You can see it still has the bearing for the templating, and this would be able to get all the way in here. But I think I'm going to give it a go with the chisel first and see how far we get. And if that fails, then I'll be switching to the router bit. So it's definitely doable to do, but I think at this point, just because I still have the template on top, I'm just gonna go and use my router instead. I think that's gonna be a lot quicker. But if I had already taken this off, then I would have proceeded with this. So I wasn't able to get all the way down as far as I wanted. And that's because this bit right here, even if I extend it further out, I can't use it because I didn't recognize that this part right here would start rubbing up against my template. So I did actually have it go into my template, but luckily just the top, which was the template, not the actual work. So my work was saved and I caught it just in time. But I am left with still just a little bit of a gap. So that will be something that I will use my chisel for when I take this off officially. So now the decision point is, do we want to router the outside of all of this as well? Because we can absolutely do that. It's super easy to do. You can use it either with a handheld router with a templating bit, or you can do it over on the router table. One thing I will say though is never ever try to do this full length at once. This is way too big of a piece, and you're gonna find yourself in a situation where you're not gonna be impressed with your router, and it could be dangerous as well. So always go in segments. Go slowly down a little bit at a time. This is ash, so hopefully it should be okay even in the grooves. If you are using something like maple tends to really do a lot of tearing, and I'm not a huge fan of that. And always make sure that your bits are nice and clean. That's gonna prevent burning, and of course you wanna go in the correct direction. So I had a bit of a hiccup here. I switched it to my bigger blade and it's been going fine. This was already routed out. And then of course it decided to just grip it right here and take out just a little chunk. It's not so big that I can't sand it out later, but I didn't want to proceed and risk having more of these. So I think at this point what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take off the template now. And what I can do instead is I can take the same template and I can put it on the backside and I can router from the backside, or I can bring it over on my router table and I can do it on there instead. So I'm going to see what makes the most sense once I've assessed the situation. I decided to use my table router for this last bit, just because I have a really nice bit that only works with a 1/2 inch collet, which is what I have on my table saw. So that is why I am doing it over here. With the routering done, it was time to give it its final sand. I used my drum sander for the top and bottom edges, and I did a heck of a lot of hand sanding on the inside, and I also used my orbital sander on the outside. And while I am doing that, I just want to take a minute to say thank you so much for following along. It's been a while since I've given a proper thanks, but don't think that I am not appreciative, because I absolutely am. My channel has continued to grow. As of today, I'm sitting at over 12 12,300 subscribers, and it continues to grow. And I am just so thankful for each one of you who have supported me, either by watching the videos or even going online and downloading my free plans, my paid plans, or perhaps even buying some of my router plans that I have available to ship to your house. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So now that number one side is completely done, there's obviously a little bit of hand sanding that you still need to do. I have some burn marks, probably primarily because I had some bits that weren't completely clean. It did cause a little bit of burning. A great way to hide that is to just use a different kind of wood to begin with. If you have access to walnut, it's great because it basically hides all the burn marks. But essentially, the darker the wood, the less you're going to be able to see those marks as well. So just keep that in mind as you pick your wood for this project. Also, something like a wormy maple. Maple do burn a lot, but I find that when the worminess is in there, sometimes the worminess can hide some of the burn mark. So again, also something to keep in mind. But it's time to move on to method number 2 for making this tree, because we still need the opposite side. So I do have the other side all traced out on this piece as well, but I do need it to be opposite. So I have to consider that when I take care of the inside. But we're going to do this one a little bit of a different way, because we're actually going to do this one the way that you would do a bandsaw box. And what that involves is we are still going to be cutting our shape to size. So we're going to go over on the bandsaw again, and we're going to cut all of this out the way we did before. But then in order to get the inside removed, we are actually going to cut that as well. We're not going to router it. Let me show you how. So for method number 2, we are again just removing everything on the outside, and a bandsaw, jigsaw, or even scroll saw can do this for you. Just make sure that you cut your shape on the outside fully before proceeding to the next step, which is to resaw the bottom. And I am going to take off approximately 1/2 inch from this wood. All right, so the important thing now is that we have cut off our back piece right here, and now we need to cut the inside. But the only way to do that is by cutting into it. So what I'm going to do is I am going to cut in from the bottom, and then I'm going to go all the way up, and then I'm going to go around and make my way around this. Now, because this is a little bit different than a traditional bandsaw box, I'm not too worried about the inside. So I can chop this up. Doesn't matter. We're going to be discarding it anyway. But what you do want to make sure of is that you take really good care and stay within these lines here, because that's what's going to give you that really nice result. And the reason that I'm going in from this side is because this is the grain right here. So I'll be able to hide that fairly well in this seam right here, versus if I went in on this side, it's going to be a lot more apparent if I have a line that goes like this after the fact. You'll see what I mean once we get closer to the end. But for now, let's cut this inside part, and then we'll move on to the next step. I finished cutting the inside. As you can see right now, it's a complete standalone shape, and the back side of it is looking quite rough, but that doesn't matter because we're gonna be gluing it back together. The only thing that does matter is just make sure these little hairs, these little fibers that may have been pulled out, that they are put back. So just like gently go over it with a sanding, but don't worry about it being 100% straight, because you're not gonna be able to know once it is glued back together. Because essentially now what we need to do is we need to take this and we need to glue this part back together, And then we are going to glue it back to this again. And then we will essentially be where we were before, where we had routed out the whole inside. Now, if you want to clean up the edges completely, you're more than welcome to put your template back on here, and you can still use a router bit to take out the inside. But this is essentially the cheater version because it's already pretty darn clean on the inside. I do kind of wish that I would have changed the blade on the inside. I was just using my resaw blade. And then I also was going to use my brand new scroll saw. However, I don't know where I put my blades. They have gone missing. And the only blade that I had was not a very good blade. So whoops-a-daisy, not happening this time. Oh well. Feel free to sand it right now. It's a lot easier to sand it while this is unassembled versus once it is assembled. It'll make you be able to get all the way into the grooves, unless of course you are doing the routering bit. But I will just sand it right now and then glue it back together, and then we'll finish it again. I just took off the clamps. It is now glued together. There is, of course, a seam right here along the edges where we cut off the back part. As well, there is a very, very tiny seam right here, which is where we made the cut coming in. All of these can be mostly hidden just by sanding it down. So at this point right here, we're really at the same point where we were at before. Like the edges are fairly clean. I could have taken some extra time to sand the inside to essentially make this done, completely done, no router required. The only reason right now why I am going to go ahead and use a router is because I have the two different versions right here, and I want them to be consistent so that when I have them on my table, that they look exactly the same. So I am going to go ahead now and use my router just to clean it up to be exactly the same as the shape. Because when you're not using the shape, and you are hand-free cutting, there's going to be a slight variation, which would never be an issue if you were just selling one. So if you're doing any other kind of template, if you're doing one full tree, if you're doing a heart shape, if you're doing the pumpkin ones, I have lots on my website to choose from. So please take a look at those as well for all the different templates that you can choose from. So just so that you are aware, you do not need a router to be able to do this. You do have the bandsaw / scroll saw / jigsaw method that you could use as well. But I want to go ahead and show you what it's going to look like once I am done cleaning this up. And that would be the same as if I sanded it. But like I said, I am going to be using my router. So full transparency, I will be doing that, but really just in order to get them to be exactly the same. So I'll do that now, and then we'll be ready for the final reveal. And here is the result of the two different methods after sanding them both completely. Now, obviously the result differs a bit as method number 2 does have a visible seam. My seam was a little wobbly thanks to my absolutely terrible resawing, but honestly it blends in pretty well, and I think that only woodworkers would notice the difference. I personally found method number 2 much faster and a heck of a lot less messy. But I'm curious to know, would you consider making these trays with both methods or just the one? I really wanted to showcase both of these methods today because sometimes when people see my workshop and my collection of tools and machines, they feel discouraged thinking my projects can only be done using the same tools. But that really couldn't be further from the truth. Many tools can do the same thing. I personally started off with a jigsaw and I made coffee tables and farm stands, so you really don't need to have fancy tools. It just helps speed up the process, which is important when you do it for a living. But if woodworking is your hobby or passion or something you hope to do more of, then my advice is to just start with the tools you have and to be open to adapting plans, even if it means that seams are showing. Because at the end of the day, the result doesn't matter. It's the journey that's the fun part. Thank you so much for watching. For more do-it-yourself videos like this one, please subscribe and hit the notification button, and I'll see you soon in the next Wood Story.